Chris Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the quadruple homicide of his entire family nearly 7 years ago. In the years since, the Weld County District Attorney has continued to receive new and credible information concerning Nicole Kessinger's possible involvement. However, despite the ongoing barrage of requests for a full and complete investigation, he has refused them all.
When I say the word prosecutor, what phrase immediately comes to mind? Tough on crime? Aggressive? Overbearing and rigid in appearance? You ask my wife and she might jump right to arrogant. I'll admit that these stereotypes aren't too far off base.
Rigid and arrogant doesn't even begin to cover it. But for the first time in over half a decade, entirely new evidence has been discovered that has the potential to break this case wide open. Information never previously known or disclosed by law enforcement since the arrest of Chris Watts. On the 6th of November, 2018, Chris Watts formally accepted the prosecution's plea deal, agreeing to a conviction of 5 life sentences. This deal, approved by DA Rourke himself, was finalized just 86 days after the crimes Watts committed on August 13, 2018. But every single day since Watts' conviction, the true crime community has continued to find glaring mistakes, omissions, and failures that exposes the improper and incomplete investigation conducted by the Weld County District Attorney, Michael Rourke. In today's episode, we will continue with our detailed deep dive analysis of the Chris Watts case, analyzing Watts' first interview and contrasting this new information with shocking details that Watts revealed just 24 hours after he committed his crimes, providing an examination of the discovery records while shedding light on what that evidence actually reveals, helping us all to finally answer the question: could law enforcement have fully and completely investigated this quadruple homicide in just 86 days? This is In Search of the Truth, the Chris Watts Deep Dive series, the 3rd installment. In the last 2 episodes of this deep dive series, we have traversed the rocky landscape of the Watts case surrounding the days and weeks preceding this painful tragedy. We were given a deeply disturbing view of the heartbreak that Shanann was forced to endure at the hands of a man who was seemingly devoid of empathy or concern. Since beginning my analysis of this case, I have continued to receive countless messages from current and former members of law enforcement who all agree that these investigators could not have thoroughly evaluated the facts of this case in less than 3 months' time. But for the first time since the onset of this case, I will be able to definitively demonstrate for you just how inadequate this investigation was. But please remember, Chris Watts will always bear sole responsibility for his own actions. Our analysis will always be about the pursuit of justice. So as we evaluate the facts, we will remember the one and only reason why we continue to advocate for that justice: the victims. So, with that said, let's begin. Just after 2 a.m. on the morning of August 14th, Chris and Nicole have just finished their nearly 3-hour-long phone call. The same call that Nicole Kessinger will later claim that she barely recalled what they discussed or talked about. According to the discovery records, at 2:17 a.m., the two would say their final goodbyes, but not before Nicole would eavesdrop on a phone call with law enforcement where Chris was being asked very specific questions about his missing family. And earlier that same morning, Nicole Kessinger made sure to get onto Google and search for the name Shanann Watts. Over the years, we've learned that law enforcement never bothered to ask Nicole why she would be searching for Shanann at that specific point in time, especially in light of the fact that Kessinger would go on to claim that she truly believed that Shanann was okay and simply at a friend's house.
Monday afternoon, he told me that she was like gone and he didn't know where she was. And at that point, I don't think that it set off any alarms in my head, just because, I mean, I have friends that I text, and if I don't hear from them for like 3 hours or 6 hours or even like a couple days, I don't feel concerned about where they're at, because it's kind of a standard thing for me. But then she didn't come home that night. I was like, okay, well, maybe she'll come back. And I was kind of under the impression, since they're separating, that maybe she decided to take the kids. Maybe she decided to just leave for a few days. I don't know. I was just, I felt like maybe she was just trying to get some space. And I figured maybe that was why she left her stuff there, to just get some quiet.
If Nicole believed that Shanann was unharmed, then why would she be looking for her on Google? By 4:58 that morning, Sandy Ruschek, the mother of Shanann, called Chris and spoke to him for just over 4 minutes. The two would speak later that same morning at 6:32, and Chris would continue to perpetuate the claim that he did not know where her daughter and his children were, feigning innocence over the monstrosity of what he was still desperately trying to hide. An hour later, at 7:26 a.m., Chris messaged Shanann's friend Sam, continuing the lie that Shanann and the girls were likely safe. He told her, "I'm hoping she's with someone I don't know, because I have exhausted all of the people that I know of. I'm optimistic we will reunite again. People have been stopping by from time to time." 2 hours later, and Chris Watts transfers one final nude image of his paramour Nicole Kessinger into his secret calculator app. At 12:08 p.m., Nicole Kessinger spends 4 entire hours searching the internet, news sites, and articles, all concerning Shanann and the girls' disappearance. Detective Prill is careful to note that these searches that nearly took her entire workday were all deleted, and he notates this observation in red. It's my experience that when law enforcement wants to highlight an area of concern, this is exactly how they do it. But just minutes after Nicole had begun her relentless searches for news on Shanann and the girls' disappearance, Chris was communicating with friends and family again at 12:31 p.m. He was continuing to poorly fake the part of an aloof father trying to find his missing family.
Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. Like, if somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here. Please bring her back.
I will simply never understand how or why Chris Watts thought that this interview would convince anyone of anything other than his complete and undeniable guilt. At 1:36 p.m., Chris again texts Shanann's friend Sam. Sam had inquired about the possibility of issuing an Amber Alert for the girls. She was very clearly trying to do whatever she could to find them, and yet Chris could only respond by telling her that an Amber Alert was not applicable in this situation, choosing instead to quickly change the subject while informing Sam that law enforcement had just swept his house with cadaver dogs, ending their dialogue by informing Sam that he had completed all of his interviews with law enforcement in what appeared to be an attempt at trying to insinuate that he was not responsible. Chris again called Shanann's mother, Sandy, at 2:30 p.m. and spoke with her for just over 10 minutes. We would later learn that the Ruscheks were already convinced that Chris was likely involved in the disappearance of Shanann and the girls. And I can only imagine that Chris and his shocking lack of empathy was evident in every word he spoke to everyone he encountered throughout the course of that day. 4 minutes after 3, Chris again communicates with Addie. He informs her that Good Morning America has contacted his sister for an interview. And if I didn't know better, it would seem that Chris is continuing to look for ways to elicit sympathy from his friends and family. But just miles away at exactly 5 p.m., Nicole Kessinger begins a series of seemingly incriminating Google searches that would later be identified by Detective Prill's data report. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this new information directly answers the question that Detective Prill asked nearly 7 years ago. 1 hour later at 6 p.m., Chris's phone notified him of a calendar entry that he labeled as talk. In the days following, law enforcement would determine that Chris had attempted to create a trail of breadcrumbs that he hoped would lead investigators to the false conclusion that Shanann and the girls had simply disappeared. Chris Watts wrongly hoped that they would come to the conclusion that he was nothing more than a loving father trying to locate his family. Just 26 minutes later, and Chris texted his close friend Nick Thayer, letting him know that he would be on his way to his house after he stopped for gas. But while en route to spend the night at the Thayer residence, Watts received a call from the Frederick Police Department. Detective Coder was requesting that Chris come into the office and answer some questions concerning this highly suspicious disappearance of his entire family. Watts would turn around and make his way to the police department in what would become the beginning of the end of his paper-thin story. It's here that Chris would begin his first in-office interview with law enforcement. But this is also my very first time reviewing this footage, and when we conclude our analysis of all the lies that Chris told that day, you will learn something that no one in law enforcement has ever disclosed about this case. Information that is now central to my formal request to the Weld County District Attorney's Office that they finally reopen this investigation and determine the extent of what Chris and Nicole were hiding. Because it's time that we find out the truth, once and for all. By the time that Chris Watts arrived at the Frederick Police Department that evening, law enforcement was already firmly aware that he was their likely primary suspect in the then disappearance of his wife and children. Anna Darko's Human Resource Department had already informed law enforcement that Watts was communicating regularly with fellow employee Nicole Kessinger. Additionally, they had already obtained detailed phone records and knew that Chris and Nicole were far more than mere co-workers. Detective Graham Coder was tasked with the job of trying to ascertain what Chris had done with his family, but doing so without causing Chris to completely shut down. But one thing is certain, no one could have imagined just how dark this case was about to become.
Alright, let's do this. I'm going to sit next to you so we're looking at it together. So what I want to do is, we have a bunch of people coming in, from your neighborhood. Somebody saw something. Somebody knows where these kids are. And I keep saying kids, I'm sorry, your kids and your wife. And I should say, I work these quite a bit, and so tonight, if I make one of those mistakes when I say kids instead of your wife and kids, I apologize. We work it a lot, so I apologize if something comes out wrong or, anyway. So, I know you're going through a lot, so I'm not going to keep you here all night. Can we go through this?
From the moment Detective Coder walks through the door, he is demonstrating the behavior of an investigator who understands the gravity of this moment. He employs the well-known tactic of closing the gap between him and Chris, which subconsciously helps to remove his internal defenses. And in so doing, he ensures that Chris never succeeds in closing off and walking out of that interview room. It's a tactic that will slowly force Chris to do the one thing that he hates to do the most, telling the truth.
So, okay, let's see, you're 148, doorbell detected visitor. What does that mean?
So the doorbell has a camera on it when you get up to a certain proximity, and when you ring it, it detects a visitor.
Okay.
Detective Coder just asked Chris about the home security system that detected Shanann's arrival just after midnight on the morning of August 13th. Now, it's very likely that Detective Coder already knows what the security notification meant, but he wants Chris to know the enormity of the information that law enforcement already has. And even more so, he wants to hear the way that Chris answers the question. Now, if you watch closely, you can see that right after he answers him, Detective Coder stands up to close the door, and you can see Chris's body language change right before your eyes. Watts is demonstrating all of the telltale signs of a man who is trapped and very clearly doing everything in his power to hide the truth.
So I work a lot of stuff like this in bank robberies, and when I talk to a witness at a bank robbery, sometimes I find it best for them to just say, tell me what happened, get it all out, and then once you get it out, let's go over it, okay? So just get it all out as far as this. Tell me exactly what you remember, and I'll take notes about where we can go. Okay.
Did you catch that? Detective Coder has just told Chris that he would like for him to tell the story of what happened in his own words from the beginning. But he equated his past experience as an investigator to interviewing victims of a bank robbery. Law enforcement already knows that Chris and Nicole are likely having an affair based on the records they have alone. And at the same time that we see Chris in this hot seat, his mistress Nicole is just miles away speaking with the FBI at a local park, absolutely lying through her teeth. But right now, Detective Coder needs to get Chris to tell him his first version of the truth, and he needs to do it before he shuts down the interview and requests a lawyer.
So this 1:40 a.m.
Let me switch chairs. Because when they come knocking, I gotta use that key. Do you need more water?
No, I'm fine.
I brought you the area.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Detective Coder has just proven what a skilled interrogator he is, because this important seat change was started right as Chris began telling his first version of events. It's clear that he wants Chris to feel trapped by this positioning, putting himself between Chris and the door. He wants Chris to know that he's not leaving. But more than anything else, Detective Coder, the father and husband, he wants to know what Chris did. He wants to know where to find his family.
All right. So 1:40 a.m., doorbell detects a visitor. So when we were over at the neighbor's house, the next day we were looking at his camera as well, and it didn't show anybody walking up to the driveway, which is kind of weird. That's the only reason I put that on there, because it showed Nicole dropping her off, but nobody actually walking up to the house. It was kind of weird, but she was in the house. Okay.
Listen, I understand that criminals say and do very dumb things sometimes, but it doesn't make any sense to me why Chris thought anything good would come of this stupid lie. He just admitted to Detective Coder that the neighbor's camera never caught Shanann's arrival that morning, which means he knows that law enforcement is aware of the fact that the neighbor's camera also never showed anyone but him leaving that same morning. But I suppose that's why Chris can never seem to maintain eye contact throughout this entire interview, because he knows he's a terrible liar and absolutely everyone can see it.
And what time are we talking?
This is still 1:48.
Okay.
So 2 a.m., Shanann gets into bed with me. 4 a.m., that's when my alarm goes off for work, and I'm just get dressed, brush my teeth, everything I do upstairs.
Okay.
4:15, that's when I get back, slide right into bed next to her, and start having a conversation with her about having the house up for sale and talking about it, like actually proceeding with the separation.
Okay.
And obviously it gets pretty emotional, like we're talking about, like we felt this connection was there, like falling out of love and trying to stay together, maybe just for the kids' sake, but realizing that doing like our homework, it's not, most of the time that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Now, for many of us who have taken the time to study this case, all of this is very familiar. We know that this is the first series of lies that Chris will tell law enforcement, and that eventually he will alter his story more than a few times. But it's at this point of the interview that I realized something. Chris's story is surprisingly very detailed, and as we know, very fabricated. And from everything we know about Chris, it's clear that throughout his upbringing and his marriage, that he was the kind of person who followed the strong women in his life. In his early years, that was his mother, Then it was Shanann, but right here, right now, it's Nicole Kessinger. And I just can't help but notice how rehearsed, specific, and detailed this lie is. And I promise you, that will become very important in the very near future.
And it gets pretty emotional because we have two beautiful kids and we have one on the way. So it's just a matter of like, it was very emotional. We were both crying. And at the end, we just said, you know, she said she was going to take the kids to her friend's house for the day. She would be back. Okay. I was like, okay.
Listen, we all know that Chris Watts is capable of concocting lies with relative ease. But it's hard not to notice just how calm he is right now. Because remember, it's only been about 24 hours since Chris committed what is easily one of the most grisly and heinous crimes anyone could ever commit. Now, over the years, we've learned that in the hours following his crimes, he felt a sense of relief, that he was now happy because he could finally be with Nicole Kessinger. So then I can't help but ask the question, why would he be so confident in such obvious lies? It's almost as though Chris had reason to believe that this poorly planned deceit had cause. And because of new information, we now know that Chris was communicating with Nicole through a second secret app that they clearly both believed that law enforcement would never find. And it really seems that Chris believed that Nicole was waiting for him on the other side. And until law enforcement subpoenas those records, we cannot know with certainty what Chris and Nicole said. But it sure seems like his words were carefully planned with the singular intent of being with Nicole. And ultimately, to do whatever it took to get away with murder.
And so I went downstairs, made my protein shake. That was at 5 a.m. That's when I did that. Packed my lunchbox, had my oatmeal, chicken, filled my water jug up. 5:15, I went outside, backed my truck up, was loaded up. Had my book bag, my lunchbox, computer, water jug, my big clear container. I put big clear containers in my truck so it's easy just to pull out, pull in, just depending on what I'm going to use. Motor ring kit, and I knew I was going to do some stuffing box rubbers that day, so I got some various opening wrenches from my toolbox, and I know those would work better than the ones they would give me. Okay. 5:30, that's when I went to work. Okay. And I hadn't heard from Shanann for about 2 hours there, so at 7:40 I texted her and asked her if she could tell me where the kids were if she took them anywhere. Okay. Nothing. Okay.
What we just heard was Chris describing the morning of August 13th, 2018. You remember the exact same time that Nicole Kessinger's phone just happened to ping from the cell tower directly next to the Watts' home? And everything that he is saying seems so much worse when you know what he was actually doing that morning and the lengths that he had gone to completely annihilate every good thing that he had ever been entrusted with.
At 12, I texted her again, call me. Nothing. And then about 12:10 p.m., that's when my doorbell visitor, not a visitor, and I was like, hey, it popped up on my phone, and it says it was Nicole. And I tried to put it on my phone to see if she's just trying to get in or whatnot. And I hear like she's on the phone I could hear her on through my phone saying she was trying to get to Shanann, so that's when I called her. Yeah, I called her at 12:20, see what was going on. She told me that Shanann hadn't responded to any of her calls all day or any of her friends' calls all day. Okay. And that's very strange, just because, I mean, if she doesn't get back to me, that's fine. You know, like she gets busy with kids, whatever. And so if she's going to get back to her people, like the people like she works with direct sales. Okay. So if she doesn't get back with them, that's strange. Is she the type to answer the phone? For them, yeah, okay. It's like all the time. Okay. Yeah. For me, it's just like, hey, wait, I'll see you later. Okay.
It's been said so many times throughout the history of this case, but Nicole Atkinson is the reason why Shanann and the girls were found so quickly. If she hadn't been as aggressive, forcing Chris to come home that afternoon, this case may not have had the same conclusion. But it's here, only minutes into the first formal interview with Chris Watts, that I want to remind you of why we continue to discuss this case. Because in just 85 days from the date of this interview, This case and all outstanding investigatory leads will be closed by District Attorney Michael Rourke's office. The same man who from the onset of this case has told the general public in so many words that the conviction of Chris Watts outweighed the importance of completing their investigation, holding everyone involved accountable, and obtaining justice.
So about 12:40, a few more efforts from Nicole to reach her while she's there, like outside the house. Mm-hmm. And at 1 o'clock, that's when I left, and I was like, all right, I'm on my way down there. 2 o'clock when I got home, because they couldn't get in because the front door had a top latch to keep the kids in. Nicole and the police officer that was there.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So they couldn't get in because top latch on the front door was hinged, and the keypad on the outside does not work to get in the garage. So they had to wait till I got there so I can get the remote opened.
Okay.
And this is why I am a vocal supporter of Nicole Atkinson. Chris Watts was caught far earlier than his plan had accounted for. Originally, he was hoping that he would have enough time to go to work, leave at a normal time, all while sending messages faking his concern for Shanann. He needed time to get home, move her car, her phone, and all of the crime scene evidence to get it as far away from his house as possible. That's why it's so critical that Chris was interrupted before he could get home and dispose of Shanann's belongings. And it's why his story didn't make any sense in light of the evidence, because the only logical explanation for why Shanann and the girls were never seen leaving the Watts home on camera is because they left in his truck, and that Chris truly is the monster that everyone believes him to be.
So that's when I got home. I opened the garage door and we went inside the house and looked everywhere. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, nowhere to be found. Shannann's wedding ring's on her nightstand. Her phone's still on the couch. Her purse is still there. The medicine for the kids is still there. The car and the car seat is still there. And there's no sign of them anywhere.
Okay, does anyone else notice that Chris is reading from a document? That would mean that in a span of just over 24 hours, Chris created a detailed outline of the prior day's events. Put that in perspective for just a minute. Chris was not known to do things like this. He wasn't a highly organized person who was also incredibly meticulous about dates, times, and events. Well, wouldn't you know it, there was someone in his life who happened to be very detailed about dates, times, and events. And if you turn to page 942 of the Watts Discovery, you'll find this exceptionally detailed outline that came from none other than Nicole Kessinger herself. In fact, it's so detailed, it provides a near forensic level recollection of the day-to-day events concerning Nicole's supposedly short acquaintance with Chris Watts. You know, I just think it's very, very interesting that Chris is reading from a surprisingly similar document that outlines the events of the day prior in virtually the exact same way that Nicole Kessinger does just weeks later. And if you're the kind of person who sees this Everest-sized mountain of suspicious behavior from Nicole as nothing more than mere coincidence, then good news, I have some property to sell you. Okay, I'm not going to say it, but my point still stands because at some point, law enforcement needs to be honest with the monumental mistakes they made on this case, and you're about to see why.
3 o'clock, the police officer, detective, Howard, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. I butcher his name every time. I'm asking Nicole and I, questions about where she could have gone or who she could be with. At about 4 o'clock, the police officer that was there, he was checking the neighbor security footage. At 5 p.m., the same police officer, detective, and then sergeant, another officer, they showed up and they searched the house again. About 6 o'clock, I began calling around to anyone that may know something, called hospitals and hotels. 7:30, my friend Nick and Men showed up to show support, and from then on, it's his friends showing up. Shows Lauren, Dave, Jeremy, and 10 o'clock's pretty much about laid down, but I didn't go to bed till probably like 2 a.m. just because fielding texts and calls all night.
Okay.
And I was just hoping that, I mean, left all the lights on in the house, I was hoping that I'd get a knock on the door. But nothing happened.
Do you know what absolutely blows my mind about this case? It has been nearly 7 years since Chris committed this crime. And in all that time, he has never once attempted to sincerely apologize for what he did. In fact, he's done just the exact opposite. He's forced friends, family members, and acquaintances to live with this endless black hole of suffering because he simply refuses to just tell the truth. He co-opted people who loved him in an attempt to gain their sympathy, and now, once again, he's changed his story to put the blame on anyone other than himself. And one of the worst elements of this case is that because he lied so much and so often that even if he does decide to tell the truth someday, law enforcement won't even believe him. But I suppose that's why so many of us still see this case as incomplete, because the truth deserves to have its day, even if Chris refuses to participate in making it a reality.
What do you think happened?
At first, I really thought maybe she was just at somebody's house, just decompressing.
Blowing off steam?
Yeah. But after today, like with the onslaught of all the cars, all the police cars, all the news, all the canine units, it's making me lean the other direction about someone took her.
Okay.
But it's just, if someone took her, it would have to have been someone she knew. Because there's no sign of anything like being disturbed, broken.
Mm-hmm.
But like that's the way I'm leaning now. At first I thought for real she was just decompressing somewhere. I thought she was safe.
Mm-hmm.
Even though everything in the house was left there. But now it's just after the day with the news crews and everything, it feels more the other direction. And it's freaking me out. Because I have no idea where they are.
Okay.
Since I began this channel, I have spent countless hours researching every nook and cranny of this case. I have learned about Chris's upbringing, the way he carried himself with his friends, his parents, but especially around Shanann. Now, it's obvious that Chris Watts was a terrible liar and incredibly self-deluded, a man incapable of seeing the forest for the trees. But in the months following his conviction, law enforcement was so baffled by his crime that they conducted a follow-up interview at his prison in an effort to try to understand why he would do this. Law enforcement has admitted that Chris Watts did not fit any of their current or existing offender profiles. And every single time that I hear him speak, all I hear are the words of a man who I believe was so clearly influenced into committing this crime. And that's why I will never understand why D.A. Rourke refuses to admit his clear failures and finally properly investigate this crime to fix what they so clearly broke.
If you could think of anything that we could do to find them, what would it be?
I mean, everything that I've exhausted so far is like people that have car seats, because she left the car seats. And she was never just, I mean, Bella could sit in a regular booster chair, that because she's about that time.
Mm-hmm.
Celeste isn't quite there yet, but all the people that I know that have cars, they've contacted me.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's, there's definitely a chance it's somebody I don't know. Of being a guy or a girl. And she has plenty of friends through like direct sales that I've never met that could have a kid that they come and just say, hey, let's go. Like just back up in the back, put them in, let's go.
Did you just hear that? Chris just said something that I now believe is a critical part of this case. He just said, and she has plenty of friends through direct sales that I have never met. They could have a kid and they could have come and said, hey, let's go. And they back up to the back of the house, put them in and go. Chris is telling law enforcement that there is another way in and out of his house other than the front door and garage. He's giving law enforcement key information that they seemingly missed over and over again. It's evident in the way that he describes the situation that he wants them to know that there is an alternate route into his house through Verbena Court, this road here that goes directly up to their tiny backyard fence that absolutely anyone could have easily traversed. You know, kind of like an obsessive mistress whose phone just happened to ping from Frederick that morning. So it starts to make a lot more sense why Chris is now telling law enforcement how Shanann could have disappeared, because that very well may have been how Nicole Kessinger disappeared that morning.
And this is like, that's what's driving me nuts. Like, when I told the news crew, like, if she's out there, like, just come home. Like, if someone has her, or like not just has her, but she's at somebody's house and she's just decompressing, it's time to come back. Now this is real. Okay. This has gone to a different level.
Absolutely. Okay. Do you have an inkling of if it's good or bad?
Yesterday, I would have thought that she was safe and it was good that she would come home. Today, it's more on the other side. I don't think that she would let it get this far if she was just decompressing somewhere. I mean, she's not talking to anybody. As far as, people that have reached out to me that I haven't talked to in like a year that are friends with her.
What we just heard is the exact same response that Chris gave to the local news that opened the door to the public believing that he was involved. Listening to the way he says these words, it's impossible not to notice just how completely inauthentic it is. And it's evident throughout this entire series of interviews that Chris had no earthly idea just how guilty he sounded. And I wonder if someday he'll come to the realization that the only way he will ever atone for what he did is to just tell the whole truth. The DA and local law enforcement might have given up on that outcome. I still haven't.
When they look at this, what's the best thing that they can do to say, look for these contacts, look for this Instagram, look for this Snapchat.
So like the only thing on here that I would say is going to be weird because our contact list is the same.
Detective Graham Coder and Agent Tammy Lee should have been allowed to take their time with this investigation because it's only been 15 minutes and Detective Coder has already asked the question that everyone in this investigation should have demanded answers to. Coder asks Watts if there's an Instagram or a Snapchat that they can review on Chris's phone when they eventually download all of his phone data. And you'll notice that immediately after he's asked that question, Chris completely changes the subject. And sadly, it's far too early for Detective Coder to understand just how vital this line of questioning was. And sadly, it's taken over half a decade for the answer to that question to come to light. Evidence that proves the inadequacy of this investigation.
Is there any good ideas that your friends have had saying, man, I'm going to try this, I'm going to do this?
A lot of people have asked about Amber Alerts, but I'm not sure like why that. I'm sure, Amber Alerts have to do with like, all right, if you know someone has taken a kid, like since the last person you saw was the mom, and you don't think everybody's gone. Yeah. That's probably why Amber Alert's not really used in this respect.
Well, they did a press statement.
Listen, I understand that Chris was hiding one of the most vile crime scenes in Colorado history, but I genuinely cannot understand his complete apathy towards his own children. It seems like he doesn't even know how objectively bizarre his behavior is, because he can't even seem to competently fake concern over the reality that his pregnant wife and children are missing, which only further strengthens my view that the only logical explanation of why he could be so flagrant in his disregard for his family's well-being is because he knew that his mistress was waiting for him, and that all he needed to do was find a way to prevent law enforcement from finding the nightmare that he was hiding at Survey 319.
How could she have left the house?
Only way she could have left the house Somebody picked her up, but it would have to have been from the back. Because the camera in the front, when the neighbor, the way it faces the driveway, it would have picked that up. Only thing it picked up was me leaving at like 5:26.
Okay. How do you know? Is it your camera?
It's neighbor's camera.
Oh, did he tell you?
Yeah, we were all over there watching it with the officer.
Okay. All right.
They just showed me loading up my truck.
Oh.
Chris is again reminding Detective Coder that the only other way that anyone could have left the house undetected would have been through the backyard, since no other movement was picked up by neighbor Nate's camera. But Chris knows that every single person who loves Shanann is telling law enforcement that Shanann would have never left the home without her cell phone, without the girls' car seats, and without her medication, let alone everything else she left behind. But Detective Coder is no fool. He knows that Shanann didn't leave through the backyard that morning, and he knows that the only person who does know where she is and where his children are is the man sitting in front of him.
So we talked about her decompressing a few times. Where would you do that?
She would have to go to her friend's house to do that. She wouldn't just go anywhere, not with the kids.
At a hotel?
I've checked if she had any cash on her. I'm not sure like how much she would have had on her. She usually doesn't carry much cash, and the cash she had in her wallet was from Nicole the previous day.
From who?
From Nicole.
Oh, okay.
She told me that was the cash she gave her.
Okay.
I saw her when we found her purse.
For what?
I'm not sure. She didn't tell me.
Okay.
But that was the only cash she had in her wallet.
And is that still at the house, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So is her license in the law?
Yeah.
So she's got no cash that we know of, no license, no phone. Anything about the clothes in the closet, the hamper, the drawers that makes you think she packed some boots, she's going to the mountains?
Like she has so many clothes in that closet. Like it'd be hard to really tell if she took a little amount.
Okay.
I mean, if she took a big amount, it'd be pretty obvious. But like a little amount, you would never know.
Okay.
Detective Coder is going step by step through every possible item that Chris claims Shanann left behind. While it may seem like he's trying to ascertain where Shanann took the girls, it's very likely that he already knows Shanann's not coming home alive. The point of this exercise is to make Chris say out loud that Shanann left the house without her clothes, her medication, her phone, or anything else the girls needed, and let the absurdity of that answer hang in the air and force Chris to the realization that the only avenue he has left is to reveal what he did with his family. But this detective could not have possibly known the lengths that the man sitting in front of him would go to just to avoid the truth, even at the expense of being labeled one of the most evil men alive. And it's my experience that when you are dealing with someone who refuses to tell the truth, the only option that you have left is to do it for them.
Can we back up a tiny bit? You come home, no one has been in the house.
No.
Okay. No one could get in the house, is that right?
Yeah, unless you had a garage door.
Okay. And that's how you got in.
So I got it.
So at this point, you get there. Are the police there at this point?
Yes.
So you, the police, Nicole, that's it.
Her son.
Her son. What's her son's name?
I think it's Nick. I think his name's Nick.
Nick. And so you and Nicole aren't besties per se. You and Nicole.
Oh no, like we're friends, but yeah, my wife and her are really good friends.
Okay. And so Nick, you don't spend much time with Nick?
No.
Okay. Why is Nick there?
He was just with his mom.
Okay. Is there anything weird about Nicole and Nick?
Not that I really think of.
Do you think anything about your wife not being around has anything to do with Nicole and Nick?
I would hope not. I mean, like, Nicole is one of her good friends.
Okay, so let's review. Detective Coder is asking Chris about what happened when he arrived home from work the afternoon of August 13th. He then asks Chris if Nicole Atkinson and her son Nick could have possibly been involved in the disappearance of Shanann and the girls. Chris Watts knows that Nicole Atkinson had nothing to do with his crimes, and instead of showing any semblance of decency by affirming Nicole Atkinson's innocence, he instead responds by saying, "I don't know if she was involved. I certainly hope not. Try to imagine the enormity of his response. If law enforcement didn't already have considerable information that suggested Chris's involvement, he could have placed Nicole Atkinson at the center of their investigation, wasting time and, more importantly, putting an innocent person under suspicion for the crimes that he committed. And while this investigation may have been rushed, we can be grateful that the detectives involved were smart enough to see through the avalanche of Watt's endless lies and misdirections.
Begin calling around to anyone I know that could know something or maybe see Shanann. Calling locals, hospitals, and hospitals as well. 7:30 p.m. Friends, Nick and Amanda come by to show support. Okay, so that begin good. So 6 p.m. Begin calling around to anyone I know that could know something or maybe seen Shanann. What happened there?
Same thing, like everybody that I've talked to, it's just like they haven't heard from her, they haven't seen her, nothing. Called the hospital.
Who's helping you make these calls?
That's just me.
Just
At this point, that's
Are you by yourself?
I was by myself. I'm sure Nicole and other people were doing that while they were gone.
Detective Coder has been reading directly from the surprisingly detailed outline that Chris brought to his first interview. Coder reads the segment about how Chris called friends to try and see if anyone had heard from Shanann. But then he reads how Chris claimed to have called local hospitals to try and see if Shanann had been admitted. And while this detective doesn't yet know the full scope of the truth, he will soon find out that Chris had made those calls. In fact, Watts called Good Samaritan Medical Center, St. Anthony North Health Campus, Longmont United Hospital, and UC Health in Broomfield. The only problem was that Chris made all 4 of those calls in a span of just 4 minutes, so it was quite literally impossible for him to have spoken with anyone at these hospitals and confirmed the absence of his wife and children. But even in spite of the lack of information at this very early stage of their investigation, Detective Coder is about to challenge all of Watt's lies and force him to reveal his tell, to reveal the truth behind his lies.
Can we talk about something that's kind of hard to talk about? So when I work investigations like this, I have to keep an open mind on everything. Okay. And part of keeping an open mind is listening to you talk about your wife and your marriage. And the day she goes missing is the day that you guys have marital discord. Okay. So you can understand what I'm thinking about you.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Makes me sick to my stomach, honestly. Like, I know, like, I've talked to a few of my friends, like, this does not look good on you. I'm like, I know. It's like if people knew that we were having marital issues, they're going to look at me, especially with the way everything looks. And it honestly just makes me sick to my stomach because this is something that I would never do. Ever.
Now, you don't have to be a body language expert to know that everything Chris Watts just said is complete and utter BS. From the way that he responds to the question of his implied involvement to the way he holds his hands, everything about his affect implies guilt. Thankfully, the sheer volume of evidence that law enforcement was building against Watts was already considerable, and this is still a full day before the infamous polygraph. But Detective Coder isn't going to allow Chris to squirm away and deflect from his suspicion. In fact, for the next 45 minutes, this investigator is going to push Watts into an all-out confrontation. Coder is going to demand answers for what Chris did to Shanann and the girls. And by the time he's done, law enforcement will know with certainty exactly who their primary suspect is.
I know, like, you have to look at every vantage point. This is something I would never do to my kids or my wife at all. I'm not sure, like, what I could do to make people believe that, just because if they knew we were having marital discord, they would automatically look at me. But there's no, I would harm anybody in my family at all. I know we were having marital discord, and we had that conversation that morning, and then she goes, we have no idea where she is, or the kids. I promise you that I had nothing to do with any of that.
Are you telling me the truth?
I'm telling you the absolute truth.
Why should I believe you?
Because I'm a very trustworthy person, and the people that do know me, they know how I'm a calm person. I am not an argumentative person. I am a person who is never going to be abusive or physical in any kind of relationship. I would never harm my kids. I would never harm my wife. You can talk to any of my friends, any of her friends. They know me. They know I'm a low-key guy that's quiet. I'm not about confrontation. I'm not about anything that elevates to that level. I mean, if someone yells at me, screams at me, I just take it and I just try to get it by the wayside and get it back to where it's just a cool conversation to where none of that gets to that height. And I am not that person.
Over the last 2 minutes, Chris Watts has unintentionally walked himself into one of the most elaborate traps that he could have possibly imagined. Detective Coder is letting Chris convict himself. He wants him to talk because every good investigator understands that they need the defendant to tell their story because every case has the potential to end up in front of a jury or in front of an appellate court. One of the most significant things that Chris said was near the end of that segment. He said, "When someone yells at me or screams at me, I just take it." I believe that the person you need to worry about most, it isn't typically the loudmouth or the arrogant braggart or even the ones who may appear dangerous. In my experience, the most perilous person of all is the person who gets yelled and screamed at and just takes it. But it's how Chris described himself that I want you to pay very close attention to. When Coder asks him why he should believe that Chris did not harm his family, Chris responds by telling him that he is a trustworthy person. Of course, now we know that his response was a complete and utter lie, but you will want to remember his undeniable tell. When Chris Watts lies, he describes himself as someone who friends and family would call trustworthy.
So I love those shoes, even though they were winter shoes.
They were what?
Winter shoes.
Those are fur boots, aren't they?
Shanann's gonna sell them off to that Facebook marketplace. She had them on the windowsill there. And when we got back from North Carolina, she saw them sitting over there. And she proceeded to take them back and wear them every day since they got back. No matter if it was 100 degrees outside or what, she loved those shoes. She always loves those shoes. Bella, she always wore some flip-flops. She always will. She loved that dress. She loved those flip-flops. She loved that dress. She likes the buttons in the back.
Everything we just heard rings at the heart of why so many people were so affected by this case. For just a moment, erase everything you know about this case. Imagine that all we know is that this is a father sitting in a police station interview room on the heels of his entire family seemingly disappearing into thin air. So then why is he not showing any emotion? Why is he laughing and acting like this is a time to casually reflect on his daughter's favorite items of clothing? You see, what Chris doesn't seem to understand is that his behavior alone could have convicted him in front of a jury without any other evidence. No father who claims to love his children would be sitting there while they are missing with such an apathetic and indifferent disposition. Even a psychopath would find a way to fabricate the appearance of concern. But I suppose that's why law enforcement wasn't able to profile Chris, because not even they could conceive the depravity of what this man had done.
Bella loves those spaghetti strap dresses. She likes long dresses. She was a girly girl. Always. She is just like, I always like try to put her in a Supergirl t-shirt and she loved it. Every time. She always be smiling though. Bella, you have to like really kind of, like, you want some gum? She said you want some gum. She was been looking at this picture. She's always just smiling at the camera. I'm gonna find him, right? I need your help.
When I began my analysis of this case, I started with the very end, specifically when law enforcement interviewed Watts at Dodge Correctional in Wisconsin. Since that time, I have slowly worked my way back to the beginning, so you'll have to forgive me when I say that hearing Chris ask Detective Coder, "You're gonna find them, right?" Those words make me see red. Listen, from the perspective of Chris, I get that he had to lie, and I understand that people use the excuse that he was an introvert, that somehow justifies his callous indifference. But none of that is an excuse for the heinous abomination waiting for these officers at Survey 319. And that's the reason why so many of us refuse to relent on this case. Because if Chris was coerced or encouraged in any way, this case should have ended in 2 convictions, not 1. But thankfully, Detective Coder is about to pivot and walk Chris into another ambush while forcing him to reveal his true motive, the real reason why he committed this crime.
Can we keep talking about some complicated things? Some things that are going to make you uncomfortable?
No, that's fine.
Okay. And I think you know why I have to ask them. Okay. And
Hard job.
it's a hard job. It is a hard job. And I'm going to ask you one thing, and you're going to give me an answer, and I'm going to ask it just a slight bit different, and you're going to give me an answer, and then about 10 iterations of this, you might get annoyed, but I do that to make sure that we understand each other. Okay, is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have your daughters who are missing. We have your wife who's missing. Okay. And that's the most important thing right now. Okay. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So you've done very good in talking to me about this really hard conversation you guys had. Okay. Very good. That's sometimes hard. And I understand why sometimes someone in your position says, doesn't want to tell me about that. Because please go help me find my kids, and you don't need to know about my marriage argument. Okay. So I got to say, you've done very good at that. And I need you to keep doing that. So I need to ask you about your marriage and infidelity.
Sure.
Okay, tell me about it.
I have never cheated on my wife.
Okay.
And I fully suspect she has never done that to me.
Oh, okay.
Like, she's always been a trustworthy person. I've always been a trustworthy person. I fully expect if we ever thought about straying another way, that we would tell each other before it happened.
I think that sounds ridiculous.
I'm a trustworthy person. You remember just minutes ago, Chris used that same descriptor for himself when he lied and said that he did not harm his family. What we just saw was a masterful display of police work by Detective Coder. He used empathy and kindness to praise Chris for opening up about the argument that he claimed to have had with Shanann, and in so doing, Chris dropped his guard long enough to not see Coder counterpunch and force Watts to reveal another lie. Coder knows that Chris has been in near constant communication with Nicole Kessinger. He knows that Watts is lying about his question concerning infidelity, and what Coder says next, well, there's only one way to describe it. Mwah, chef's kiss.
She's always been a trustworthy person. I've always been a trustworthy person. I fully expect if we ever thought about straying another way, that we would tell each other before it happened?
I think that sounds ridiculous.
Okay.
Because in the history of the earth, nobody ever does that.
Okay. I just that's what I would like to think.
Okay.
I mean, I know mistakes happen, like,
Sure. Yeah.
but that's what in my head, that's what I would think would happen. I would hope would happen.
Okay.
But
now, even though I think that sounds ridiculous, if I was in your shoes, I'd say the exact same thing. And I believe that. Okay. But I kind of don't. And you can imagine in my job, I meet all kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine that there are people who have Saturdays with their girlfriends and Sundays with their wives.
Okay.
Right? And they consider themselves to be very virtuous people.
And this is why I believe D.A. Rourke made an enormous mistake by allowing this investigation to stop after just 86 days, because Detective Coder and his counterpart, Agent Tammy Lee, were far and away the only law enforcement agents who understood how to get Chris Watts to talk. Detective Coder called out Watts' obvious lie, but he knows that he has a lot more information that could cause Chris to completely shut down. Right now, Chris Watts is there on his own volition, and Coder understands that if he pushes too hard, too fast, their investigation will come to a halt and will be funneled through the lens of an aggressive defense lawyer. It's a tightrope walk that Detective Coder does with masterful precision. And while Chris continues to deny having an affair, in the next few minutes, Detective Coder will change the subject entirely and expose Chris in another lie that he will not be able to recover from.
When did you start pulling out?
it wasn't in the last 5 weeks. It's been an ongoing process for probably about a year.
Why?
I just felt like everything that we had when we first started dating and met, like we met in 2010, everything, your new relationship, spark, everything's hot and heavy, everything's great. Get married, everything's still great. And then people just fall out of love. And that's where I was. Like, I just felt like over the last year, I thought that, okay, maybe this is just like a phase. Maybe it's, this is what happens. Like, you've been with somebody so long. Maybe the spark isn't there, just reignited somehow, some way. But, our conversations weren't the same. Like, when we were apart, everything was just short, and it was just nothing felt right anymore. The disconnection was there, and it just never felt right anymore.
But why?
There is a very clear reason why Detective Coder is asking Chris about his marriage falling apart. This detective already knows that Watts began his affair with Kessinger around the same time that he claims his relationship with Shanann completely collapsed. Coder is trying to gauge what kind of person Watts is, and sadly, every time he asks the question, but why, he's obtaining a clear view of who Chris is and exactly what he was capable of doing. And can I just mention for a second how annoying it is that Chris is speaking fluent Nicolese right now? Listen, I'm not judging you if you use the word like as a filler word, but this is a grown man, and it's impossible not to notice that he talks exactly the same way that Nicole Kessinger does whenever she lies. Our conversations were the same, whenever we were apart, and it was just and I didn't feel it like. Chris, for the love of God, stop it. Okay, I'm sorry, but I do have good news. We're going to skip the part where Watts continues to overuse the word and arrive at the moment where Detective Coder finally confronts Chris. The moment where Chris will finally show real emotion, but not sadness or empathy or anything that a normal father would be feeling on the heels of losing his entire family. Chris Watts is about to show this seasoned detective the anger he's been hiding this whole time. Pay close attention to the next 10 minutes because it is the most important segment of this entire interview.
So let's have the hard conversation again. Okay. How old are they?
4 and 3. So it'll be 5 in December.
Okay. You can imagine that every day that goes by,
It gets harder to find.
where we don't find your girls, it's going to get harder to find. We're going have less clues, things that we need to get and we need to use, the methods that we need to do to find them are going to start getting blown away by weather, getting re-recorded over themselves at the surveillance for that's going to tell us. All of that is going to disappear, okay? And that's why we're going to spend so much time today, tomorrow, as in the front as we can, right? You can also imagine that every day that goes by, we're going to be looking for the man who did this, okay? And you can imagine that we're going to include you as that man. So, let's talk about that. I think that you're trying to put on a brave face because you're a man and you're a father and you're a husband. I can tell that there's just something you're not telling me. And I'm not sure what it is. I don't know why that is. I don't know why you're not telling me, but there's something that's making you a little bit uncomfortable tonight. I just don't believe some of the things you're telling me. Okay, I just don't. Simply do not believe you.
Detective Coder has just called Chris out on the numerous lies that he already knows he's told. Coder clearly wants Chris to sit with the reality that the things he's told law enforcement do not ring true. And that's why he took the time to carefully construct this confrontation. It's why he told him directly that he simply does not believe him. Because the words that come out of Watt's mouth immediately after he's told that he's a liar tell law enforcement everything they need to know about the man sitting in front of them claiming to love his family.
I just don't believe some of the things you're telling me. Okay, I just don't. Simply do not believe you.
What makes you think? What have I said that makes you not believe me at all?
This just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't add up.
What have I said that makes you not believe me at all? Those are the words of a guilty man. And if I knew nothing else about this case, and this was the only interview that I was ever allowed to see, this would be the moment that I knew that Chris Watts was guilty of this crime. No innocent person would speak this way, but there's something very interesting about his answer that sheds light on the person sitting in that seat. For years, experts have opined that Watts' behavior demonstrates the actions of someone who is a disconnected introvert with signs of psychopathic tendencies. And he wants to know specifically what he said that sounds so incriminating so that he can change it. It's a near textbook example of the way that psychopaths and sociopaths behave. But now that Coder has him against the ropes, he will reveal a truth about Chris that is one of the most poignant and accurate descriptors of the man that would come from this investigation. The tale of two Chris's.
So can we talk about two Chris's? Okay.
Two Chris's.
The tale of two Chris's? Okay. And you need to help me know which Chris I'm looking at today and which Chris you really are. So, Chris number one is right here, right? And fell out of love with his wife. Okay. Started wondering what it might be. He didn't have a wife to take care of and a girl to take care of. Spent some time alone, liked that time alone, came home, may or may not have had a conversation about how to get out of this marriage or how to fix it, but probably how to get out of it. Is looking at a bachelor pad in Brighton and did something terrible to his wife and kids. And that may have been an accident. And I think it was an accident.
That's not the Chris you're looking at right now.
I want you to try to imagine that you are sitting in that seat right now. A veteran detective has just spent the last several hours revealing the numerous inaccuracies in your story, and now he's directly accusing you of committing a quadruple homicide. So what would you say in response? Well, if you're Chris Watts, your response is to say, that's not the Chris you're looking at right now. And in some weird and twisted way, that might actually be true, because the man sitting in front of this detective isn't the same man who just hours before committed one of the most heinous crimes you could imagine. But I suppose it's good that Chris Watts was arrogant enough to think that he could talk his way out of this crime, because it's the words he would speak over the next 24 hours that would guarantee that he would never see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his natural life.
What do you think it's going to look like when someone finds out that it was not you that called 911?
Everybody's going to have their own perception about what's going on here. But I know my wife. I know that sometimes she doesn't text me back. I know that happens. I've been that. It's happened multiple times throughout many days. If she's busy with work, it doesn't happen.
Chris was just asked what he thinks the general public will say about his inaction concerning not having called 911. And in response, he says, everyone is going to have their own perceptions about what is going on here. For the last 7 years, Chris Watts has continuously shown his disdain for everyone who watched this case unfold in real time. He believes that he doesn't owe anyone anything at all. Not the truth, not accountability, and certainly not a sincere apology to the family whose lives he destroyed. But if you could distill my central reasoning for why I believe this case remains unresolved, it's because I believe that his lack of humility only lasted this long because he truly believed that this would end with Nicole Kessinger by his side. And while he will never live to see that day, I want to do everything in my power to make sure that Nicole Kessinger is held accountable for whatever her involvement may have been. And even though the two of them will never be able to be together again, maybe they can settle for sharing matching jumpsuits instead.
We're back to a tale of two Chris's, Chris.
Okay.
There's a Chris who cares.
I care. I promise.
Tell me about the call to your daycare.
To the Primrose? I called them to see if the girls were there. He said they weren't there.
Okay.
I told them since they weren't there, just put them back on the waiting list.
That's not what you told me.
I told them that we were going to sell the house. We're going to put it on the market, and we probably won't be in the area anymore.
That's two different things, Chris.
Well, I wanted them to be back on put them on the waiting list since they weren't there.
Why weren't they there?
I don't know.
Where were they going to go?
They went to Shanann took them to a friend's house.
Why wouldn't they go to daycare?
I am not sure. Honestly, sir, I am not sure.
Detective Coder is in the final stages of this confrontation, and for the first time since Watts walked through that door, he's about to see that other Chris, the one he knows is responsible for this crime. Coder starts by asking Chris to explain what happened when he called Primrose to tell them that the girls would not be coming in that day. As usual, Chris lies. He says he called Primrose to see if the girls were there. Now, Coder knows that this is entirely untrue, but instead of ignoring it, he completely calls out his lie and lets Chris know that he knows it's a fabrication. Immediately, Chris pivots and concocts an entirely new set of lies, now saying that he told them that he was going to sell the house and asked to put the girls back on the waiting list. But law enforcement has already spoken with Primrose Elementary, and they know exactly what Chris said the day prior. And what he actually said was that the girls would no longer be attending that school at all. He never said anything about putting his house on the market, and Coder knows that. But the more he pushes Chris, the more that he can see this man has no interest in revealing any version of the truth. But watch this next segment closely, and specifically look at Watts' behavior and mannerisms, because Detective Coder is about to tell Chris the one thing that will cause him to show his true colors and reveal the other Chris, the man who Detective Coder knows actually committed this crime.
It's hard for me as a father to talk to you about this.
I know.
Not because it's the hardest to talk about, It's because I'm worried about your daughters under your care.
You shouldn't have to worry about them under my care.
Okay.
I watched them all weekend. I went to a pool party at Jeremy Lindstrom's house. It's like, I love those kids with all my heart. Nothing in this world would ever make me do anything to these kids or my wife.
This was truly some of the finest police work that was conducted by anyone during this investigation. Detective Coder has just sprung his trap and forced Chris to show who he really is. But I want to revisit that moment one more time as Chris responds to Coder saying, "I'm worried about your daughters under your care." Listen to his tone and the way that Chris responds to that statement.
I'm worried about your daughters under your care.
You shouldn't have to worry about them under my care. I watched them all weekend.
Did you hear that? Just how angry Chris sounds when he said, "I watched them all weekend." It's one of the only times that we get to hear and see what Chris Watts is truly capable of. You see, Chris spent most of his life hiding in plain sight. He fooled everyone around him into a false sense of security that he was a safe and harmless man, because he doesn't seem to understand that just because he was a generally good person before the morning of August 13th, that does nothing to change what he did. In this case, the bad so far outweighs the good that even mentioning the man he was before is a slap in the face to the memory of his entire family. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Some of the most dangerous people you'll ever meet, they're the quiet ones. The people who hold in their anger and do just like Chris said in this interview. The people who stay quiet and take it. And if you ever have the misfortune of meeting someone like that, there's only one thing you should do. Run.
Nothing you've told me tonight makes sense. Nothing you've told me tonight feels like the truth. Can we start over?
Sure.
I think that there's something that happened that got maybe a little bit out of control.
There was no fight. There was nothing physical. It was a conversation. We didn't raise our voice. Nothing. I promise you that. So there was nothing physical with this conversation.
Nothing you've told me tonight makes sense. Nothing you've told me tonight feels like the truth. The words that Detective Coder just spoke are powerful, and they force Chris to come to the realization that this isn't going away, that he is going to have to reveal the truth, or at least some version of it. But in response to this direct confrontation of Watt's entire timeline of events, what we see is Chris choosing to continue to lie. And his obstinate refusal to share space with the truth forces Detective Coder to the realization that the only way they will find Shanann and the girls is to force this man to see the truth, to see that there's no way out. But before Detective Coder concludes this first interview with their prime suspect, he will place one final piece of bait on the line and ask Chris the question that every good law enforcement investigator knows to ask. The question that will eliminate any further doubt of who is responsible for the disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Cece.
When we find the guy who took him, what do you think we should do?
Honestly, they're going to come home safe, correct? When you find the guy.
When we find the guy, they're going to come home.
Life in prison would be that's what I would think with 2 kids.
When we find the guy who took them, what do you think we should do? That's a question that law enforcement uses to gauge the subtle and overt response of the suspect they are interrogating. The idea is simple. An innocent man in this situation would likely advocate for the most serious sentence available. They would demand justice and want the offender to be shown the most serious form of punishment the law would allow. On the other hand, a guilty person would support a much lighter sentence because they know that that sentence is going to be the one they serve. And what we just saw was Chris Watts playing the award-winning role of the guiltiest man alive. But isn't it strange that Watts asked Detective Coder the question, "They're gonna come home safe, correct?" I'm sorry, but what kind of stupid question is that? I'm starting to wonder if Watts suffered from some kind of TBI, because that's the only logical explanation for such a shockingly idiotic question like that. Now, just for a second, indulge me. In what universe would this detective possibly know whether or not your children are coming home safe or not, Chris? Now, I'm not dumb. I know you probably thought it was smart to try and sound like you believed your family was safe and coming home. But in retrospect, everything you just said, in light of what we know you did, is completely disgusting. And the worst part of it all is that you are now using religion to shield yourself and hide behind it so that you don't have to take public responsibility for your own actions. But don't worry, because Chris isn't done humiliating himself yet. In fact, he's about to double down.
What if you hurt them?
I'm not sure if that penalty is even used. Is it used in Colorado? I'm not even sure.
What is?
The death penalty.
Okay.
If these kids are not alive, there's nothing you could do to cope with that, to make me cope with that, if those kids are not okay.
Okay, so let's review the nonsense words we just heard. And I quote, "I mean, if these kids are not alive, there's nothing you could do to cope with that, to make me cope with that, if those kids are not okay," unquote. Now, if I didn't know any better, I would say that this is the first alpha build of a ChatGPT response that is so filled with complete BS that it no longer qualifies as existing within the lexicon of the English language. But let's go ahead and break it down. Chris just said that if these kids are not alive. Wait, did you mean your kids, Chris? But then he says there's nothing you could do to cope. And it's almost like immediately he realizes how dispassionate he sounds. So he corrects himself by saying that if something happened to those kids, not his kids, there's nothing you could do to make him cope with that. Chris, let me hold your hand with a paper towel in between and say the obvious thing right now. This is not how a concerned father who actually loves their children talks about their disappearance. But it's here, at the conclusion of this first interview, that I want to reiterate something very important. I accept that Chris Watts is responsible for this crime, that his actions leave the only logical conclusion that he actually deserves far worse than spending the rest of his life in prison. But we have to remember that in the eyes of the law, Chris Watts can retain responsibility for this crime. He can spend the rest of his life hiding behind a veil of prison religion while at the same time sharing the legal responsibility of this crime with anyone else who is involved in any way. Until now, I have been reticent to say these words, but they are important in light of what has been revealed over the last several chapters of our analysis. I believe the evidence we've uncovered supports the claim that Nicole Kessinger is likely involved with directing, encouraging, or inspiring Chris Watts to commit this crime. And that is precisely how Charles Manson was charged and sentenced to life in prison. The law recognized that his influence, direction, and coercion was the central cause of those horrific crimes. So there's only one thing left to say. District Attorney Michael Rourke, it's time to do your job. The job you were elected to do. It's time to put aside your pride, your ego, and your inability to accept criticism, and finally, do what justice demands. Because frankly, after all these years, I'm sick and tired of watching the entire true crime community do your job for you. Over the last several years, there has been a considerable shift in the political climate throughout the United States of America. But no matter what side of the aisle you are on, one thing we can all agree on is that our elected officials remain accountable to us. No one is immune from criticism, most especially the DA of Weld County, Colorado. Until now, everyone who is even remotely familiar with the story has been told by DA Rourke, CBI, and local law enforcement that Chris and Nicole communicated for the very last time on the morning of August 14th, 2018. Law enforcement tells us that they confirmed this with Chris's cell phone records, despite admitting to never properly searching Nicole Kessinger's phone or the myriad of information that she intentionally deleted from it. Because we know that at 6:21 p.m., the day of August 14th, Nicole Kessinger was busy searching the internet for news concerning the disappearance of Shanann and the girls, the same person she would claim that she was not at all concerned for her safety. But in Detective Prill's report, he notes Nicole's detailed and obsessive searches that she continuously conducted over the course of several hours throughout that day. Searches that were all deleted. But the detective, he takes it further and writes the following. These searches were conducted frequently by Kessinger throughout the next several days. She deleted every single one of them after each search. We also know that at 5 p.m. that same afternoon, Nicole was frantically searching the internet, wanting to know, can cops trace text messages, and how long do phone companies keep text messages? Detective Prill's report could not have been more clear. He was practically pleading with his fellow law enforcement colleagues to conduct further investigation into the uncertainty of where Chris and Nicole were communicating from. But in case you need a reminder, let's briefly revisit a mere fraction of the facts we now know concerning Nicole Kessinger's treasure trove of lies. Time and time again, we have demonstrated the numerous occasions when Nicole Kessinger's story simply did not line up with the truth. We have proven that Nicole lied about not knowing Shanann's name, a name that she searched on Google half a year before ever claiming to have met Chris Watts at all. We know that Nicole patently misrepresented the seriousness of her relationship with Chris, lying to law enforcement and downplaying the constant pressure that she was applying to him in order to compel him to leave his wife Shanann. We also know that she told Chris that he would have to choose between her and his wife, and we proved that Nicole lied and claimed to be encouraging Chris to fix things with Shanann during his family trip to North Carolina, but in reality was sending Chris daily nude images to entice him to choose her instead. And the evidence substantiates that on the morning of August 13th, 2018, at the same time that Chris was in the process of covering up his crimes, Nicole Kessinger's phone pinged in Frederick at the cell tower directly next to the Watts residence. And in this episode alone, we've learned that the road that led up directly behind the Watts residence was a perfect route in and out of their home, which would have ensured that Nicole would not have been detected by the neighbor's security camera. The sheer volume of circumstantial and physical evidence that supports or suggests Nicole Kessinger's influence or outright involvement in this crime is both shocking and substantial. So when we arrive at this moment on the evening of August 14th, the day after the crimes were committed, and we see Detective Prill nearly shouting at the DA, telling them that Nicole Kessinger was hiding a trail of information, it demands that DA Rourke finally answer this question. Mr. Rourke, why did no one in law enforcement or in your office ever bother to ask Watts or Kessinger where these pictures were coming from? Your discovery evidence clearly demonstrates that you conclusively verified that the pictures were not coming from Chris's text messages. So then why didn't you do your job and ascertain their origin? Now hold on, before you answer, I actually have good news for you, sir. Because after 7 years of you and your office outright refusing to properly investigate Nicole and determine the truth, I want to let you know that I've done your job for you. See, I know the answer to that question, and before I tell it to you, I want to read this segment from your discovery evidence one final time. I am certain Watts communicated far more with Kessinger than is reflected in his phone data, perhaps facilitated through the secret calculator application. It became apparent he was receiving assorted nude images of Kessinger that she was taking by herself and sending to Watts, which he then stashed in that application to prevent Shanann from ever seeing them. Months ago, I spoke with Chris Watts' former cellmate neighbor, Dylan Tallman. During our interview, I asked Tallman a series of questions concerning his friendship with Watts during their incarceration. It was during our conversation that Tallman randomly brought up the information about Watts and Kessinger's activities, and without even asking, he told me exactly where they were communicating from. The following is a brief excerpt from that interview.
Chris he got in a fight with Shanann and over this stuff. Like, I know he said something about using a WhatsApp. And
Right.
the only way you can access that WhatsApp is if you go on his phone.
Wait. Chris said he had a WhatsApp account?
Yeah, that's what he told me.
Wait.
WhatsApp.
Hold on.
It was WhatsApp.
Has anyone from law enforcement ever asked you about this?
No.
So Chris admitted that he was communicating with Nicole over WhatsApp?
Yeah, that's like Facebook. It's like
Right. No, I know what it is.
Twitter. It's a profile you have. Like we have.
Yep. It's a
Instagram.
messenger service.
Chris Watts and Nicole Kessinger were communicating from the third-party application WhatsApp. So I would like to ask you, the audience, why in God's name is a YouTuber finding this new critical case information nearly 7 years after this case was closed? How can DA Rourke or anyone in his office claim to have done their job when we are still finding out new information over half a decade after the fact? Because the next logical step in this process would be to find out what Chris and Nicole said in those messages, to subpoena and obtain the records, the logs, and data from WhatsApp, and ascertain what Nicole knew at what time and the extent of what she was hiding. And as I've said, there is a reason why so many current and former members of law enforcement have continued to speak out in these comment sections, because they recognize that this case remains incomplete. So the next time someone tells me, why do you still talk about this case? I'll remind them that if I can find out new information about Chris Watts this long after the case was considered closed, then I can only imagine what else law enforcement could find if they would simply do their job. Last month, on May 30th, the Chelan County Sheriff's Department received a call from Whitney Decker. She explained that her daughters had not returned home from a scheduled visitation with their father, Travis. After a weekend of frantic searching, law enforcement would eventually locate Decker's truck near an empty campground in central Washington. Eventually, the remains of 5-year-old Olivia, 8-year-old Evelyn, and 9-year-old Peyton were found a short distance from the campsite. Their father, Travis Decker, remains the subject of a nationwide manhunt and is the primary suspect in the triple homicide of his own daughters. You see, these cases aren't about maintaining a high conviction rate. They're about justice. And for some reason, the Weld County DA has completely forgotten that. Every single time I sit in front of this computer, every time I read the words of a coroner or study the interrogation of a determined detective, every single time I try to comprehend the confession of a father who chose his own selfishness over the lives of his children, I am reminded of my reason why. Why I choose to stand with each of you, to remind those around us why these lives matter so much. Because somewhere in the eyes of these children, we see the reflection of our own sons and daughters, and in some infinitesimally small way, we feel the pain of their loss. Because at the heart of every case where a life is stolen is the realization that we want this nightmare to end. We want to arrive at a time and place where innocence no longer has to fear the selfishness of anyone capable of committing these crimes. And I know, like so many of you, these little ones, they're our reason why. Because all I know is if this was my daughter, if this was my mother, my sister, or my friend, if I had known Shanann, Bella, and Cece, or if I had been the one to comfort the Rooschecks during the worst moment of their lives, and someone out there who had a hand in this crime remained free, and if now, all these years later, she enjoys a life where her guilt has transformed her into a shell of the woman she was, I would want someone to do what I'm doing right now. And I would hope that they would choose to fight even when I couldn't. Because sometimes doing the right thing feels completely impossible, and it requires more of us than we know how to give. But as long as the truth remains unknown, and as long as justice is out of reach, I know that I'm not alone when I say, we will not give up. We owe it to Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico to continue to fight for a new investigation, to renew our commitment to advocate for justice, and to do whatever it takes to bring the truth to light.
Blow on it, Cece. No, don't let her touch the plate. No. Blow on it, Cece. Okay, look. Blow. Cece, blow. Guess what, girls? Mommy has a baby in her belly. Are you guys excited? Yes? Are you really excited? Oh my goodness. Now give me hugs. Oh. I love you. I love the baby. Can I give the baby a hug? I love you, Bella. You're so sweet. Give me a kiss.
Hi, buddy.
Say hey, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy.
Everybody, let's invite Nana and Papa.
Papa.
Oh, Pop-Pop's on.
Hi.
Say hi, Pop-Pop.
Hi, Papa. Hi, Papa. Hi, Bobo.
Say hi, Pop-Pop.
Hi, Papa. This is with us. Sissy. And that is Sissy. Oh, I'll say with her. Don't take her away.
I'm not taking her away.
In closing today, I want to take a moment to tell every person who is listening to the sound of my voice just how grateful I am to have you here. Being able to create content is one of the most amazing gifts that each of you give me by affording me your time and thoughtful engagement. Now, I know it's been a while since we were last together, and as many of you know, I've had to tackle some very serious health issues since the beginning of this year. Thankfully, I have begun to respond to a new therapy regimen that is finally starting to work. But I want to thank each and every person who took the time to write, to comment, or to just send well wishes. You cannot know just how much they meant to me. In the fall of 2020, I resigned from my position at my law firm. I had spent the better part of half a decade trying and failing to manage the aftermath of what has been 36 different surgeries since the time I was a teenager. When the doctor sat me down and told me that I was receiving a medical disability rating of 100%, I almost couldn't believe it was real. Just saying the word disabled out loud left me feeling so much shame, and as though my injuries were somehow my own fault. But over time, I began to realize how many other people were just like me. People who were going through life with pain and injuries that they too had to learn how to live with. Over time, I made the choice to allow my pain to blossom into something that has now completely changed my life. A perspective that has made me more empathetic and genuine and understanding. And I guess that's why I take the time to do this, because I know the only reason that I'm here doing what I love is because of each of you. But I really want to thank these people, many of which have supported me for years now. People who wait patiently as I slowly and methodically create the next series of videos. Each and every one of you have restored my faith in humanity, because you don't have to show the support that you do, and yet you do it anyway. Now, I realize that to some this might seem odd, because I know that it's not something that most creators in this space do, but please understand what I mean when I say that I actually really truly love all of you for the ways that you show kindness and support. It's the reason why I continue to push through each and every surgery, because I know that when I return, I will be greeted by some of the best people you could possibly imagine. So thank you to the Patreon and YouTube supporters. Your support is quite literally the reason why I am able to do the work that I do today. Now, I do actually have some very exciting news. Over the last 6 months, while I was recovering, I have been writing my very first ever manuscript. It's a true crime thriller that is also based on my life. It includes what I believe to be one of the most shocking endings that you will ever read in a book. And yes, I understand how bold it is to make such an overtly audacious statement, but I assure you, when you are done reading this book, you'll understand exactly why I made that claim. Over the next several months, I will be publishing segments of the book in audio format on my Patreon. So if you like true crime or true crime thrillers, you're going to want to come join our community. But if that wasn't enough, I am also working on an entirely new series that will include a very special co-host. He is one of the most well-known and successful celebrity comedians in the world, and he will be joining me as a featured guest on this channel. And I promise you, even when I'm quiet, I'm always working on something behind the scenes. Also, I'm finishing a new chapter of the Jodi Arias case because many of you have continued to ask for that. And as usual, I'm not done with Chris Watts or the other myriad of cases I am working on. So, when you see what's coming next, I promise you, you're going to want to subscribe. But again, thank you so much for the privilege of being here with you today. I've really missed all of you, but I'm very happy to be back. There really is so much more to come. But as always, this has been Behind Criminal Minds. We'll see you next time.